Hey everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and in today's video we're going to do something different and talk about the Kin Play Tower 2s. Now this is an active speaker system available in white or black, and it has a retail price of $2,250. Now depending on what your thoughts are at the end of this video, these are on sale at the moment, which could change the value prospect a little bit. As with any video or when you're shopping products, always look at the current sale price and compare that to some others you may have been considering, because sometimes that price way could be a make or break difference on what you consider. Now, I know that a lot of people watching this may not be familiar with the Kin brand, and that's part of why I wanted to do this video, because I actually met some of the reps when I went to Axpona last year, and I try to be kind of selective in the early stage of my speaker coverage to only cover speaker brands of things that I've heard at shows that I know I kind of like, only because I can only cover so many, and if there's something I want more of the public to know about, that's the reasoning behind it. I will be covering more speakers in the upcoming years, whether good or bad, of course. I just can only cover so many. So the Kin brand is like an entry-level brand from a parent company called Totem Acoustics, and it's a Canadian company that makes high-end speakers with a wide variety of prices. Now, flagship speakers are excellent. I'm not trying to take away from that, but they are a little bit on the pricey side, and obviously not everyone can afford that. It's not just the speakers that you typically buy, but you have to get supporting equipment such as amplifiers, processors, preamps, etc. What makes the Kin Play Tower 2 special in this case is that they are active speakers, and if you're not familiar with that means, active means that there's an amplifier inside. It's actively powered, as opposed to passive, which the majority of speakers are out there. And those passive speakers connect to, let's say, a Denon amplifier or some kind of amplifier system so they can work. This guy has its own power supply built into the left speaker with a lot of inputs, and it's a much cleaner, simpler setup in your living room. Now that's perhaps the most important thing to consider here. It's not just comparing a $2,200 speaker system against another $2,200 speaker system, because the majority of the ones out there aren't actively powered. So when you consider getting an amplifier system for that, which a decent one can be anywhere from $500 or $800 just as a ballpark, and then you add that to the speaker price, well, suddenly things kind of start aligning a little bit differently. Now, I mentioned before, this is available in white or black, and I think the big appeal of this is depending on your living room or listening space and what your setup is, not everyone has space for an AV rack and processors and all this stuff, and you want a clean aesthetic, but you still want good sound, and frankly, a soundbar isn't going to cut it, and that's where something like this comes in. Now, funny enough, Kin does make other speaker form factors. They have two different bookshelf designs, and they have a soundbar. So I wasn't just saying soundbars before to knock all soundbars in general. Typically, you want to go with a separate speaker system when you can. Not everybody can, and if you cannot, it doesn't mean you have to have terrible sound, and that's where the Kin soundbar came from, which is about $1,000. Those aren't going to have pounding bass, but Kin also makes a subwoofer system that works with their entire lineup if you want that bass. They even have a wireless module kit for it, so if you can't put the sub near the TV, or you do a sub crawl and you can put the sub somewhere else in your room, well, now you don't have to deal with wires running everywhere. Now, obviously, I have the Tower 2s here, so that's what we'll be focusing on. And these have a lot of power, 200 watts times 2, and they're rated to go down to 30 hertz, which I did measure, and I will talk about sound quality after, but they rate it down to 30 hertz plus or minus 3 dB. I validated that. My roll-off started to happen right about 32 hertz, and then it kind of tapered off. And that is also affected by your room to an extent for what you actually hear. But that performance is great. To not have a subwoofer and to have an active system like this get that deep, not everyone's going to need a sub to enjoy their music. Now, in addition to the subwoofer output, inputs are obviously very important. And let's start with HDMI ARC, or audio return channel. This is not eARC, but it doesn't really matter in this case because that is more beneficial for higher bandwidth surround sound audio. Because this is a 2-channel system, you have to set your TV or whatever your source is to PCM, whether you're using ARC or one of the 2 optical inputs that this also has. Now, ARC also allows your TV remote to control the volume of the towers and turn them on and off. So this is a very seamless system. You basically plug them into the wall with a single power cord on the left speaker. There's a standard non-proprietary speaker cable that connects the left and right speaker to each other. And then with an HDMI connection to your TV, that's basically all you need. You can use the TV remote, turn it on, the speakers will power up, and now your remote will control the volume, which is super handy. Now you're not restricted to only use HDMI ARC, you can use optical, and this has 2 of them on the input side, and it even has 2 analog connections as well, with both standard RCA and a 3.5mm input, depending on what your sources are. Now in addition to the physical connections, this also has Bluetooth, which is to me one of the biggest selling points of this, because I talked about convenience and integration earlier. Not everyone wants to go through a whole stack of components, and even if you have a full system, maybe this is for another room and you just want something a little bit simpler. So having HDMI and Bluetooth is very convenient, and this remote that's included with it will also allow you to control and choose all of your inputs. You can see that there's a play, pause, forward and back arrow. When you are connected with Bluetooth, this will work and control the device that's paired to it if you're using a media player such as Tidal or Spotify. You have the Bluetooth source to select, and then if it's paired to a single device, well, you go to your mobile phone, select the KIN tower, and you're good to go. Now the big kicker is the pairing button right on the remote. There is a volume knob on the left tower, and you can press and hold it to put it in pairing mode, but with this, it's so simple because let's say you're technically inclined and you know how to use your system easy peasy, right? You don't have to struggle trying to figure something out. Not everyone in your household may be that way. So you can tell your significant other or a family member in the house or whoever's there, if you press the pairing button, you will see a blinking blue light on the front of the tower. And then on your phone, you just search for the KIN tower speaker and tap it. It'll connect within seconds, and now that person can enjoy the volume and support that these speakers bring to the room. Audio should be easy to listen to, not just sound good, and the experience is such a critical part, so I love that they made it that simple. I mentioned the opticals. You can toggle between both opticals by tapping it multiple times. You have 2 RCA or analog buttons here, one for RCA, one for 3.5. Volume, and then you can see the bass and treble knobs. Now, I did measure the performance. It's basically a 5 decibel swing when maxed out or minimized, and there's 3 steps positive and 3 steps negative for both. Now, I have to warn you about one extra input that says amp in. It's a 3.5mm connection, so you can use the other end to be terminated how you wish. You know, it's a 3.5 to dual RCA, for example. That bypasses the internal preamp of the towers, and if you do that and you connect it to something with a fixed volume output, these will play at full volume the second you hit play. It can damage the speakers you're hearing, not a pleasant experience. So just keep in mind that if you don't have full control over the output of your device, never use that amp input. That will bypass all the other sources. It's basically jacked straight into the volume of the towers, and it can come in handy if you're using something like a streamer that has its own variable output or variable preamp output. And if you do that, sure, you can use it that way. Me being a fairly cautious person when it comes to that level of power, I don't recommend it unless you know exactly what you're doing. So just keep in mind that's what that's for, and you've been warned. I wish they put a little sticker, like a warning sign next to it so people know that's fixed volume, but I think they assume most people are going to be technically inclined enough to not question that or set it up that way. I just know there are people out there that may not realize what fixed and variable means. So let's talk about the drivers used on the tower themselves. And starting with the tweeter, it's a 1-inch soft dome tweeter, but it's titanium coated to increase rigidity and power handling. Now each tower has dual 5-inch drivers, which helps with power handling between the bass and the mid-range, and then there is a rear port in the back. And if you look inside that rear port, you will see some internal dampening inside to kind of help with some resonances. The towers weigh over 35 pounds each, obviously a little bit more weight on the left speaker considering the amp is inside, but not too heavy considering their size. Now, despite weighing just over 35 pounds a tower, the speakers are rather inert as well. The cabinets do a good job at soaking up vibrations, and they also have an isolated bass. What's really important to understand speaker performance is resonance transference into the floor. There are companies like ISO Acoustics and other companies doing things to isolate any vibrations from the cabinet to the ground. This doesn't use a traditional carpet spiking system. A lot of higher end towers often have metal spikes, which worry a lot of people. You either don't want to put holes in your carpet or risk scratching a hard floor, and you have these little discs and stuff that you can place it on. That is a great solution. It sounds great, but it's not as attainable or usable by some people that are more apprehensive or nervous about using that. So what's cool about the towers is it has an isolated platform. There's actually a little bit of a gap between the enclosure itself and the bass. And by doing so, the bass is isolated from resonances from the main cabinet, which also means they don't have to do anything special on the feet. This is a rather large platform or footprint on the speaker. It's a little bit bigger than the speaker themselves, which does help maintain some stability. So even if you have a thick and softer carpet, the speakers don't come across too wobbly and they still pull this off without needing to use spikes. So that's a pretty good feat as well. Now I want to call out the grill design because you can see the drivers are here. Now the grill's attached with magnets. So the reason why this is nice, and I've seen a lot of brands do this, it's not exclusive to Kin at all, but it's worth pointing out. A lot of companies, when you remove the grills, some people like seeing their drivers, and when you do that, you often see the little holes that grill covers attached to. I like the cleaner magnetic look because you can rock it without the grill and it'll still look really clean. And that's obviously very easy to install as well. Additionally, the grills are white, so that's a huge win. A lot of times if you get white speakers, the grills aren't always white to match, or maybe they're gray. So if you're concerned about the aesthetic for a living room, having an all white setup or all black is also a really nice tie-in. So I want to get into sound quality and start with the subjective side first this time. I do have some measurements of these speakers, but I want to start with a warning on this. So if you're new to my channel, one, huge thank you for stopping by. I do measure a lot of headphones, gaming headsets, IEMs, etc., and that's much easier to measure in a fixed controlled environment because we have ear simulators and such. However, when it comes to speaker measurements, rooms impact the sound dramatically, not a little bit. And that's why when you see measurements, there's often discussion of anechoic measurements. If you place the speaker in an anechoic room, which is not a living room by any means, you can measure the frequency response of a speaker. There's a solution out there called a Clipple system, and there's a YouTuber that goes by Erin at Erin's Audio Corner. He's a really nice guy. He covers a lot of the objective and scientific stuff of speakers. I don't believe he's covered the Kin speakers before, but if you want to see anechoic measurements of speakers, he's the only one I know of that is actively covering speakers in that capacity. However, I will explain my measurements and why that's still important as well, because I think it's complementary to each other. So getting into subjective sound quality and what I hear, well, the Kins really are a fun sounding speaker, and it's not just in a generic term. As far as the bass goes, it is punchy and it's really dynamic, but it doesn't come across as overly deep. So even though it does have relatively flat extension down to 30 Hertz, a lot of this does come down to room placement, but I found that when I compared it to my larger Martin Logan Towers or my T+A Caruso speakers, those tend to have a little bit of a deeper sounding bass, but they also didn't sound as dynamic or punchy or lively as the Tower 2s. So if you want a more energetic sound, especially if you're using this for like a party speaker and you just want to play music when you have a lot of company over, these sound great in that regard because that's the kind of bass that tends to be a really fun, easy to listen to sound. It's also versatile too, because if you listen to rock music or something that isn't hitting as deep, you don't want to lose some of that bass energy anyway. So it's not overly boosted, it's not overly warm sounding. In fact, I find the bass to have a little bit of a dip until you get into the mid-range. So while the bass is really punchy and dynamic, vocals don't have a lot of hefty weight to them. They are more forward though. I did notice that when I compared to several other speakers I have, this wasn't bad because it wasn't shouty or anything like that, but vocals definitely have a lot more presence and bite on the Tower 2s. So this could be viewed in two ways. One, if you're using this for content consumption for things like, you know, Netflix or Disney Plus, and some of those recordings or shows, the dialogue isn't as forward compared to the action scene where there's explosions happening, things like that, and you're constantly adjusting the volume. Well, having something that has a more forward vocal presentation will help kind of reduce how much of a swing you hear in those situations. And then because it's not too forward and it's not too shouty, it's just nice for music in general. It helps with guitars and again with rock music, but again, it's not so overly done that it's greatly coloring the mix. I do prefer this type of sound as long as there aren't any faults that go with it. Now, I don't find this overly sibilant. There was a couple songs where, you know, this presentation with that little bit more bite in it, it really comes down to the mastering of the song before it could skirt the line as too forward. But that's more because the song is recorded that way. This isn't doing anything to magically alter a bunch of recordings you have. I also find that it doesn't have a lot of upper treble extension. When I compared it to my T+A Carusos, and the Martin Logans are different because I have the ones that use the ProMotion AMT tweeters, which really have a narrow listening window because their dispersion of their tweeters, like the higher upper frequencies, it's really narrow. So if you're not in the sweet listening spot, those sound darker, like a lot. But if you're in the correct spot, it's brighter. So this is a nice safe treble. I don't have a lispiness to it. Nothing sounds overly sparkly or metallic, but it also doesn't sound like it sucked all the air out of the song. The T+A Carusos have noticeably more air and presence, so if you are chasing the upper treble more, those are a little bit brighter speaker. Now they're more expensive and they don't come with an amp. I'm just kind of comparing against stuff that I have. My Bowers and Wilkins speakers are also a little bit more bright, but there's much more disconnect from the crossover point of vocals to upper treble. The crossover setup that's on this is much more seamless. I think a good speaker should be one that if you close your eyes or if you're not focusing on the point of the source, you shouldn't be able to discern which speaker is doing what. You shouldn't be like, oh, that's the tweeter part and this is the mid driver, I can tell. It should just be a cohesive presentation of sound. And that leads me into placement. Now, the manufacturer will recommend certain distances off the wall. This does help with imaging and sound presentation. I think my ideal setup was the front baffle was right about 38 inches off the wall for my room. That gave me the best performance for the whole phantom center. If you go further in towards the wall, it's going to boost bass because now the room gain or the effect of that wall right behind the bass port is going to be more prominent as it gets closer to the bass port. So positioning it off your wall will also impact the sound. These can go as little as with the back being about a foot off the wall, but that really depends on your space. If you have a smaller room and you're putting these close to the wall, well, I'd recommend their bookshelf speaker instead. I think it's going to play better there. Now, I mentioned the bass and treble adjustment on the remote, and the bass adjustment will add up to 5 decibels of bass or reduce it by that much, and it goes all the way up to 500 hertz. So it does color the low-end mid-range just a little bit. It's not like it's just a bass lift at 100 hertz, for example. Conversely, the upper treble and mid-range, when you adjust the treble, it's adjusting all the way down to 1,000 hertz. I wish it started closer to 4,000 or 5,000 hertz for the treble adjustment because I wouldn't want to lift 1 to 2K any further. But if you're chasing a little bit more air, then yes, you can boost the treble. Just keep in mind, you're also going to be boosting that forwardness in the vocal region as well. So if you're listening, this is going to come down to more of you don't always just adjust both and that's your setting for everything. The one nice thing is if you find tracks that are too forward in a certain area or you don't like the way something is produced, this is kind of a quick adjustment to maybe just dial in the sound a little bit more to personal preference. Now, I do want to touch on power handling. This is rated for 200 watts. They get incredibly loud. They don't get as loud as a much higher powered system, which using dedicated amps and more expensive speakers. But if you are pushing the bass, if you bass boost it, don't expect to get close to like 80% of the volume capability that it has. You're overworking the drivers at that point. These aren't really bass shy. So if you are chasing more bass, I mentioned the subwoofers earlier, you can still get these incredibly loud, but you might have to pull the bass response down a little bit and then backfill that lack of bass with a subwoofer. And that's going to give you the most power handling if you're chasing high volume. This still gets loud enough, but if your room is like, 30 by 40 feet, for example, then I would recommend considering at least one subwoofer to help in case you like also listening at higher volumes and you want the bass to go with it. Now, getting into objective sound quality and the measured side, I mentioned the whole thing earlier about anechoic room measurements. Those are super valid and it's a good accurate way of measuring a loudspeaker's performance without the room's impact on it. However, when we listen to it in our own rooms, well, the room is impacting it and that will change to an extent the speaker's performance. So I use a Cross Spectrum Labs calibrated microphone. It's a UMIC 1 from Mini DSP. And then I do a moving mic method where I go to the main listening position. The microphone gets moved several times in the general area of my listening position, and then I take multiple measurements in those spots. Then you average it out, and that's how I get the in-room frequency response of these speakers in the key listening area. With that being said, if we look at the measurements here, this is the room gain I was talking about. Now, these speakers are rated down to 30 hertz, plus or minus 3 dB, and I got really close to that. Here's 72 hertz, or 72 decibels, and down here you can see 65. My fall off really starts happening right about 33, 34 hertz, so it's pretty close. My room gain kind of falls off a cliff right about 65 hertz, so this node, or this gain feature of the room, is boosting that bass area just because of the way it's positioned. Now, if I move 10 feet back, all of that extra bass is gone. It's just a matter of where you sit. This little scoop right here, again, part of this is a byproduct of the room. I don't want to focus too much on saying this is the inherent characteristic of the speaker. It is just slightly cooler in the vocals. They don't have like an overly warm sound, but they do sound very neutral. It's close to how I expect voices to sound. Now, one thing that was apparent even in the in-room measurements is this whole 1 to 2K region. You can see that from flat, if we just pretend that this is the flat line here, the average response, you can see generally that area is a little bit lifted. And that is the part that stood out the most when I compared it to other speakers. I usually preferred the Totem's performance in vocals because they were more forward in the mix, and frankly, it just made it more enjoyable, especially with a busier track that tends to drown out the voice. It's all a matter of preference, but this is kind of, I think, the signature sound of the Totem speaker, or at least the Kin speaker in general. The rest of the tuning is relatively flat and linear in my room, but you can see the roll-off I was talking about in the higher frequencies. Mine pretty much started right about 12,000 hertz. Now, the frequency response is rather wide. These tweeters have excellent dispersion from a width standpoint and relatively tall as well. They're taller than my other speakers, but if you're in the right listening area, it sounds really coherent. It's not like overexcited or anything like that. And because their sound profile being relatively wide, your listening position, your primary listening area, isn't stuck in a very narrow window. You can sit multiple people on a couch, for example. If you have company over, people can be walking around and everyone's still going to enjoy the music thanks to that wider pattern. So I keep talking about speaker placement and the room having an impact on sound. So I wanted to do something different, and this is going to be a binaural recording. So I use a dual Audio-Technica shotgun mic system, the AT897s, connected to a floating point field recorder. I played the same songs in my studio that has room treatment. I'm using thick carpet, heavy curtains, and GIK acoustic panels, multiple panels throughout the room with different back panels on the back wall to handle the cross-room reflection. In my living room, I have carpet, I have a couch, and some big curtains. That is it. There is no treatment there, and the room sounds wildly different. So these are the same two tower speakers at the same volume level in two different rooms, and I want you to hear the difference. So if you have headphones or IEMs or whatever, that would be a better way to listen. Put those on and check this out.
Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in cross up the ones who hit my cries and watch me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. And what's so bright? It's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
So how wild is that? The same two speakers in two different rooms, and it can sound quite different. Now, in addition to room treatment, as I mentioned, placement is important, but you could still get the general idea. These are a great sounding speaker. It's not the only option at $2,000 roughly. And what I think Kin is trying to do is make good audio attainable in two different ways. One is the pricing. The other is the ease of use, because what good is it if it's complex to use and half your household can't enjoy it? That is such a key thing to factor in, and why you're starting to see things like AirPlay being used on $3,000 amps. That's not the best sounding protocol, but people use it because it's easy. And the idea of just being able to quickly connect with Bluetooth from whether you have an iPhone or an Android phone is really convenient, and that means the more people in your house can enjoy good sound. It's also really nice if you have company coming over and they want to just play some music. So in addition to that, if you're shopping and comparing this to other things at a retail store, like a home theater in a box or a soundbar system from Samsung, for example, I've seen those sell for over $1,000. And purely on the music side, these will absolutely destroy that. You can put the speakers in the right place. It just sounds so much better. If you don't have that space, well, Kin makes a soundbar for $1,000 as well, that even without a sub still gets down to 60 hertz. And these are all big solutions over what your experience may be. Again, in different colors, different price points, sizes, etc. So I'm going to end with saying this isn't like the only and best solution out there, but I think it's certainly worth considering, especially in the price range. It's worked perfectly for me. I've had it for a couple months now. So I hope you found this video helpful and you learned something new about a line you may or may not have heard before. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching and making it to the end. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. I'd love to see you at the next video. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.